asked for the establishing of a Georgian master narrative in a context, the maturation of historical writing also implied a further alienation of the academic from the other social and ethnic groups. The enhancement of professional standards was accompanied by drastic reductions in readership. Javakhishvili's History of the Georgian Nation represented a huge work in progress. In 1908, he more or less analyzed the gaps of a research program that needed to be filled for the next editions. Written in Georgian, it was not easy to read. It represents a scientific treatise without a coherent story to tell. In the preface to the second edition of the History of the Georgian Nation in 1913, he once again admitted, I quote, "History is a difficult science. It will never become a recreational book and always has to be a discipline of study and deep inquiry. Besides that, the history of the Georgian nation is not yet sufficiently researched in a scientific manner that would empower the historian to write without any references." End of quote. Therefore, his History of the Georgian Nation was written for an educated and prepared audience, in short, for the Europeanized and national-minded Georgian intellectual elite to be convinced for the national world perception acknowledged by the international community of scholars and nations. Even if Javakhishvili introduced the concept of scientific writing of history and clearly distinguished between the everyday life and scientific standards, patriotism and science, this concept was seriously challenged during Georgia's troublesome history in the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Oliver. And as usual, any questions, comments? So, floor is open to anyone.
Well, I guess the thing is I'm curious, what are the sources that you use in investigating this question? Are there, I recently read the biography of say, E.H. Carr, for example, which is largely based not around the things that he actually wrote, but by the large amount of communication that he left behind in his own archives, which are at various universities, and the communications on the other hand, the receiving end. Many of them actually from the publishing companies. I wonder, does that sort of thing exist for somebody like Javakhishvili as a source to understand what his thinking was in these processes?
So there are sufficient sources available. So it's the Center for Manuscripts, or Center of Manuscripts for my Institute of Manuscripts. There's a huge font only about Javakhishvili, so you can rely on his letters, or the exchange of letters with others, really, that you can follow up what did he write, when what questions were up to the point. You can rely on also this survey data, these letters what they received back with the filled in by students. It all is there, really. There is an abundance of sources available, but really the point is that they are also, to a certain degree, published recently, but they're not really investigated in a conceptual way, really. Writing history as a process, and really trying to reconstruct it as a process, and what was really going on in this time. And it's very important, really, to follow up, because Ivane Javakhishvili is very active also in the movement of professors who were teaching in these so-called people's universities, so with an idea of educating the broader society in a time, and it's very active also in disputes with Russian scholars about the autochthony of the Georgian Orthodox Church, for example, in 1906. And this all can be followed back. For me, very important will be then the kind of antagonism between Ivane Javakhishvili on the one side, really, who moved from Petersburg then to Tbilisi, founding, establishing university, and Nikomar, who became the doyen of Caucasian studies in Petersburg, who stayed there and really became a very influential figure in the early Soviet period with his Japhetic theory and so on. And this kind of antagonism really is something what I really would like to investigate in greater detail later on. But therefore, so really, what I'm intending is really to have to read very closely what is in this history. Everybody is using it and referring to it in Georgia, but do they really read it? And there are several biographies available as well by Georgian authors. The most interesting and the most recent one is by Guram Khoranashvili, who really tried to put it into a context. He's a most critical-minded historian who finished philosophy of history at Moscow University, and is probably a little bit also an outsider in the historical profession. The historians may correct me, but this is my impression really also about debates among historians that were ongoing in the 1990s. And so this kind of deconstructing Javakhishvili really to make him more actual. And I think with some points I try to highlight in my presentation, demonstrate how actual this really is. You know, when I look really about the Museum of Occupation, for example, really, or the certain monuments that were destroyed and so on, or Institute of Marxism-Leninism, yeah? So really how a society is dealing with its past and what does it mean really for the future of a society. But sources are sufficiently there, really.
And all of these questionnaires are in the original in
Yes. Yes. So I copied some of them and I took all the data. I have to enter them into a database, and sometimes there were lengthy comments about political developments. You know, it's a unique source. Edward Kudua, by the way, hindered me to that source, but it's never been. So here's a short description of it, but nobody really investigated it so far. It's really great stuff. And they tried to conduct something similar later on, but this was not possible because then World War I started, and really the comments there, and sometimes they signed with their name so that you know who was it. You know? So also their political affiliation, and it became quite clear from that that the major part of the educated elite of Georgia were socialist federalists. And only a minor part was either Marxist, so social democratic, or national democratic. So the dominant was a socialist approach, like in Russia also. So this was the dominant stream among educated people. But the small group of Marxists really managed to get in touch with the broader Georgian agrarian society and to interpret Marxism in a way that it becomes meaningful to the peasant communities. And that is a success story what is not really discussed in Georgian historiography, to my point. Of course, Stephen Jones does it.
Thanks, it was very interesting. I have a question about the questionnaire that you mentioned. Well, I'm a sociologist, and I haven't really known that that kind of research existed before being interested in science. So I'm wondering what kind of questions are there? I mean, what exactly was the point of research to get what kind of information, if you know? And who were the contingent, who was the contingent that you actually sent this questionnaire to? Were they students? Were they just members of the elite who lived abroad? Professors of the... And I have another question. You know, about that article that you had against Javakhishvili and about making history, Cheshmarit the history and so on. It's my personal opinion, but I always think that history is subjective in every single way. Because it's created by people, it's written by people, and especially if especially if it's not the written documents that you have, if it's based on cultural norms and so on, it's always very, very subjective. So How do you think, did he achieve his goal of making the ethnicity study of Georgian nation, or is it still, was he still, I don't know, cornered or bordered by the subjectiveness of the sources that he had before, or just studying, I know that he studied the parts of Georgia, different parts of it, so did he succeed?
Good. Two questions. So the first one, the questionnaire. 15 questions, starting with where are you born, which social milieu you are from, so noble, peasant, and so on. Education, so you could trace secondary education. Very similar to what I did with this Society for the Spread of Literacy, so kind of a collective biography what I wrote. And this is really very good updated data, so really from 1913. So where they come from, so the movement of these people, and education was something that changed their life. So really they became socialized in another environment, in Russian environment, Petersburg, what was also termed as a laboratory of modernity in the Russian Empire, so really very up to date. Yeah. Then there were questions about occupation, what they are studying, about political affiliation, and maybe I thought also, I think some birth year or sort of review that you could, and the addresses were students. And the major, most questions were sent back from the universities in the Russian Empire, so Petersburg and Moscow, the strongest, but also Kiev, Odessa, Kharkov, Warsaw. The Marxists were from Warsaw, and then some very few from Western universities, Paris, Heidelberg, Hohenheim, Agrarian University. So, and they were all students or PhD people. This really is the reason for this, why they conducted it, was really to assess the potential for a university. I think after, I didn't find some evidence for that yet, but my hypothesis is really after not getting the one and only chair for Georgian language and at Petersburg University, he was working towards establishing a university in Tbilisi. Because also a university is also a marker for a modern nation. A modern nation must have its own university. You know? So this was something very important. The kind of approach. Yeah. So yesterday I had a presentation about the state of the arts of Georgian historiography. Of course, you have to assess the historian in his environment, and the dominant paradigm in early 20th century was German positivism and Rankian historic writing. So the sources speak for themselves, and the historian should give no interpretation, just present the sources and put them in an order, neglecting any kind of interpretation with that, by selecting the sources, by the sequence, how you present the sources, and so on. This is also a narration already. But in that time, what Munslow calls reconstructionist approach, so to reconstruct the past as it really was. And this was a dominant stream in Western European historiography at the time, and Ivane Javakhishvili brought, with his attempts, really there. Then in the early 20th century, where there came a constructionist, who also did not deny that there is a past that can be found, but you need to apply certain concepts